They organized my funeral before a body was even found, sold the company I built over a decade, and prepared to ship my daughter off to boarding school just to enjoy my fortune. Standing outside the heavy oak doors of the Seattle courthouse, I listened to their lies. I took a deep breath and pushed the doors open. They thought this was an inheritance hearing, but it was a death sentence for their greed. My name is Elena Vance, and for the last 3 months, the world has believed I'm dead. The air conditioning in the hallway of the Seattle Superior Court bit through my thin blouse, but the chill settling in my marrow had nothing to do with the temperature. I pressed my back against the cold marble wall, tucked away in an alcove just out of sight of the bailiff stationed at the entrance of courtroom 402. At 36 years old, I was listening to the sound of my own life being dismantled piece by piece. Through the heavy oak doors, the muffled but heated exchange drifted out like smoke from a fire. Sarah Jenkins, the only person in that room who actually gave a damn about the truth, was speaking. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the stagnant air. Your Honor, the speed at which the petitioners are liquidating the assets of Aura Space Solutions is not just unprecedented. It is suspicious, Sarah argued, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. We are talking about a company valued at over $20 million being stripped for parts in less than 90 days. There is no body. There is no death certificate. There is only a presumption. Then I heard him. Mark, my husband. The man who had vowed to love me until death parted, us apparently decided he could not wait that long. His voice was thick with a performance of grief so convincing it almost made me want to applaud. Your Honor. I am just trying to protect what Elena built, Mark said, his tone dripping with false humility. The market is volatile. I cannot let her hard work vanish because of legal delays. I'm doing this to preserve her legacy. We just want closure, Your Honor. Another voice chimed in. My mother. Susan. Her voice trembled with the theatrical sorrow that I'd heard her practice in front of mirrors my whole life. My father. Robert, murmured his agreement right beside her. Seeing her assets frozen. It is like losing her all over again. Please, grant the transfer so we can move on. I bit my lips so hard I tasted iron. They sounded so pathetic, so broken. But then came the sentence that turned my sadness into cold, hard rage. And regarding our daughter, Lily, Mark continued, his voice lowering to a somber pitch. My in-laws and I agree that a boarding school in Vermont is best. She is 7. The environment here. It is too full of memories. She needs distance to heal. She is a heavy responsibility for a grieving father. A heavy responsibility. My daughter, my beautiful artistic 7-year-old girl, was nothing more than an obstacle to them. A piece of baggage to be shipped 3,000 miles away so they could spend my money in peace. Acid rose in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a flash of the last 3 months playing behind my eyelids. They had not waited for a body. They had not waited for confirmation. The moment the news of the landslide in Peru hit the wires, they had not launched a rescue mission. They had launched a liquidation sale. They erased me not because they had to, but because it was convenient. I looked down at the manila folder in my hands. Inside were not just medical records from a dusty clinic in the Andes. They were the receipts of my survival and the proof of their treachery. My knuckles were white as I gripped the file. This was my weapon. That wooden door was the only thing separating the sterile reality of the law from the grotesque theater they were performing. I took a deep, shuddering breath and adjusted my grip on the crutch under my left arm. I caught the eye of the court security officer Sarah had briefed earlier. He gave me a subtle nod, his hand resting on the brass handle of the courtroom door. It was time. I was done hiding in the shadows of my own life. My mind drifted back to a time that felt like a different lifetime, though it was only 4 months ago. Back then, I was not a ghost haunting a courtroom hallway. I was the CEO of Aura Space Solutions, a woman who believed she had curated the perfect existence. My life was a glossy magazine spread come to life, complete with a sprawling glass-fronted house overlooking the steel-gray waters of Lake Washington, a thriving career in high-end interior design, and a family that I adored with every fiber of my being. Mark was the picture of a supportive husband. He would mix me a martini when I came home late and listen to me vent about supply chain issues. Yet, looking back through the lens of betrayal, I could see the rot that had been there all along. It was in the way his jaw tightened when a magazine featured me as an entrepreneur to watch. "It must be nice," Mark had said one evening, swirling his drink a little too aggressively, "to have the world convince you that you are a genius just because you picked the right shade of beige." I had laughed it off then, blaming the Scotch and his own stalled architecture career. I did the same with my parents, Robert and Susan. They lived in a comfortable condo I paid for, driving cars I leased, yet their hands were always outstretched. They constantly pitched me vague investment opportunities that required immediate infusions of cash. "We just need $40,000 to get in on the ground floor." "Elena," my father had urged over Sunday dinner, his eyes gleaming with a hunger I mistook for ambition. "Do you want your parents to be dependent on you forever?" I gave them the money. I always gave them the money. I was so busy being the provider that I missed the small, sharp daggers in the dark. I remembered waking up one night to find Mark bathed in the blue light of my phone, his thumb scrolling rapidly through my bank notifications. When I stirred, he claimed he was just checking the time, but his heart was hammering against my ribs when he laid back down. I remembered walking into the kitchen and hearing my mother whisper to my father about community property laws and land deeds, only for them to switch to loud, cheerful chatter the moment they saw me. The only pure thing in my life was Lily. My 7-year-old daughter was the sun my world revolved around. Every night, she would press a crayon drawing into my hand before bed. "This is a shield, Mommy," she had told me the night before I left, handing me a picture of a stick figure surrounded by a purple bubble. "So the bad dreams cannot get you." I should have listened to her. The trip to Peru was supposed to be the pinnacle of my career. I had secured an exclusive contract to source rare Andean opal for a luxury hotel chain, a deal that would skyrocket the valuation of Aura Space Solutions. But as the departure date approached, a cold dread settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with fear of flying. On the morning of my flight, the house felt too quiet. I hugged Lily so hard she squeaked, inhaling the scent of her strawberry shampoo, terrified for no logical reason that I would forget it. "Take care of her, Mark," I said, looking up at my husband. "Please, just keep her close." Mark did not meet my eyes. He was busy adjusting his watch, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. "You are going for 2 weeks. Elena, don't be dramatic. We will be fine." My parents were there too, but their concern was oddly bureaucratic. They had spent the entire week badgering me about updated travel insurance policies and estate planning. "It is just standard procedure for international travel, sweetie," my mother had insisted, shoving a stack of documents across the marble island in the kitchen. "Just sign the power of attorney. It is merely a precaution. If you get stuck in a remote village, we need to be able to pay your bills." I signed. I signed everything they put in front of me because I wanted to trust them. I wanted to believe that their anxiety was born of love, not calculation. I walked down the jetway that day with my passport in hand, believing that the 3 people waving goodbye were my safety net. I had no idea I was looking at the architects of my destruction, and that by the time I returned, the woman who boarded that plane would no longer exist. The first week in Peru was a deceptive paradise. I had found exactly what I needed in a quarry deep within the Andes, a vein of opal so vibrant it looked like frozen fire. I remember holding a rough sample up to the sunlight, thinking about how perfect it would look in the lobby of the new hotel project. We were heading back to the town of Cusco, the contracts practically signed in my mind, ready to celebrate. But the weather turned with a violence I had never seen before. The rain did not just fall, it hammered against the roof of our rented SUV like bullets. The dirt road, which had been treacherous enough when dry, turned into a slick river of sludge. The driver, a local man named Mateo, gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes wide in the rear-view mirror. "It is too much water," Matteo said, his voice tight with fear. Then came a sound that I will never forget. It was not thunder. It was a low, guttural roar, like the earth itself was screaming in agony. I looked out the window and saw the mountainside above us moving. It was a wall of mud, rock, and uprooted trees descending with terrifying speed. "Hold on!" Matteo shouted. Before I could brace myself, the world tilted, the ground beneath us dissolved. I remember the sickening sensation of weightlessness, followed by the deafening screech of metal tearing against rock. The car rolled once, twice, 3 times, plunging into the abyss. Glass exploded inward, showering me in jagged confetti. My body was tossed around the cabin like a rag doll, slamming against the door, the roof, and the seat in front of me. The noise was a cacophony of destruction tires popping, steel crumpling, and my own voice screaming until the air was punched out of my lungs. Then everything stopped. I woke up to the smell of gasoline and wet earth. Pain was a living thing, radiating from my left leg and exploding in my skull with every heartbeat. I tried to open my eyes, but warm, sticky blood sealed the left one shut. Through my right eye, I saw the twisted frame of the vehicle wrapped around a massive tree trunk, suspended over a drop I could not see. The silence was absolute and terrifying. The jungle swallowed every sound except for my own ragged, wet breathing. I tried to move, but my leg was pinned. I reached for the satellite phone in the center console, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. It was my lifeline, my only connection to Seattle, to the rescue teams, to my family. But when I pulled it from the debris, the screen was shattered, the casing bent in half. It was dead. I was cut off from the entire world. Panic tried to seize my throat, a cold grip that urged me to give up. But then, through the haze of concussion, an image floated to the surface of my mind. Lily. Her gap-toothed smile. Her drawing of the purple shield. If I died here, she would be alone with them. That thought forced air into my lungs. I could not die. I would not die. Lily. I whispered, the name scraping against my dry throat. Mommy is coming. I must have passed out again because the next thing I knew, rough hands were lifting me. I heard voices speaking a dialect I did not recognize, urgent and hushed. Locals from a village miles away had found the wreck. My luggage, my passport, my wallet, everything that proved I was Elena Vance had been washed away by the mudslide into the raging river below. To them, I was just a broken, anonymous body in the mud. They carried me down the mountain on a makeshift stretcher to a small, impoverished clinic miles from civilization. There were no MRI machines, no specialists, just a kindly doctor with limited supplies and a surplus of prayers. I slipped into a coma that would steal 6 weeks of my life. While I lay there, trapped in the darkness of my own mind, fighting a fever that nearly killed me, my family in America was busy. They did not wait for DNA results. They did not wait for the search parties to scour the river. Mark, Robert, and Susan seized the narrative. They told the press I was missing and presumed dead. They dressed in black, stood before cameras, and accepted condolences while simultaneously filing the paperwork to erase my legal existence. As I battled for every heartbeat in a dusty room in Peru, my husband and parents were already carving up my empire. Consciousness returned to me not with a flash of light, but with a rhythmic, rusty squeak. Squeak, whir, squeak, whir. It was the sound of a ceiling fan struggling against the thick, humid air. I opened my eyes and saw a stained water spot on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country I did not know. The smell hit me next, a nauseating cocktail of cheap antiseptic, boiling corn, and the metallic tang of dried blood. I tried to shift my weight, and a scream died in my throat, emerging only as a dry rasp. My left leg was encased in a heavy plaster cast, elevated on a sling. My ribs felt like they had been bound with barbed wire. For a terrifying minute, I stared at the peeling yellow paint on the wall and realized I had no idea who I was. I was just a vessel of pain in a room that smelled of death, A man in a white coat that had seen better days shuffled in. He looked tired, his face etched with deep lines. He checked my vitals and spoke in rapid, broken Spanish. "Señora," he said gently, adjusting the drip on my IV. "You are milagro. Miracle. You fall far, very far." The word fall unlocked the door, the landslide, the mud, the screaming metal. "Elena." My name is Elena Vance. "My family," I croaked, my voice sounding like grinding stones. "I need to call my family." It took 2 days before I had enough strength to hold a device, and even longer to convince a young nurse to lend me her cracked smartphone. My hands shook violently as I tapped in the password for the clinic's spotty Wi-Fi. The little wheel spun on the screen, taunting me. I expected to see messages from Mark asking where I was, or missed calls from my parents. When the connection finally snapped into place, the phone vibrated so hard it nearly fell from my grip. But it was not a flood of love. It was an avalanche of administrative erasure. Ding. Chase Bank. Your personal identification number has been successfully changed. Ding. Wells Fargo wire transfer of $200,000 initiated to an external account. Ding. American Express. Your request to close the primary savings account has been approved. My breath hitched. I scrolled down, my vision blurring. These alerts were dated weeks ago. Weeks. How long had I been out? I opened my email. The inbox was full of auto-replies. I clicked on a company-wide blast sent from the board of directors. The subject line read, "In loving memory of CEO Elena Vance, restructuring announcement. It is with heavy hearts." I read the first line, but my eyes skipped to the bottom paragraph. Effective immediately, Mark Vance will assume the role of acting CEO to ensure the continuity of Elena's vision. They had buried me. With a trembling finger, I opened the social media app. There he was. Mark. He had posted a photo album titled "Saying Goodbye to My Soulmate." The cover photo showed him standing at a podium in a black suit, looking devastatingly handsome and shattered. My mother, Susan, was in the front row, a lace veil covering her face, clutching my father's hand. "We may never find her body." Mark's caption read, "The jungle has taken my angel, but we must find the strength to let her go. For Lily, for her legacy." I zoomed in on the date of the post. It was only 10 days after the accident. 10 days? They had held a memorial service while I was lying in a coma, fighting off infection in a village whose name I did not even know yet. I scrolled through the comments. Hundreds of people sending prayers. And then I saw a comment from a reporter asking about the private search and rescue team Mark had promised to hire during his initial press conference. Mark's reply was short. "The authorities advised us that the terrain is too dangerous. We have to respect nature." Liar! The phone slipped from my hand and landed on the thin blanket covering my chest. They never hired anyone. They never looked. They took the first report of a landslide and used it as a winning lottery ticket. The physical agony of my shattered leg was blinding, but it was nothing compared to the cold, hollow ache spreading through my chest. The man I slept next to, the parents I supported, they did not just think I was dead. They wanted me dead. They had rushed to close the book on my life so they could cash the check. I stared at the ceiling fan again. Squeak. Whir. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, broken and penniless. But as the tears finally spilled over, hot and angry, I realized something else. I was still alive, and they had made a fatal error in their calculations. They forgot to check for a pulse. I waited until the night nurse, a kind woman named Maria, had finished her rounds before I made the call that would change everything. My fingers felt heavy as I dialed the number I had memorized years ago. It rang 4 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. Law offices of Sarah Jenkins. "How may I help you?" "Sarah," I whispered, my voice rough from disuse. "Do not hang up. It is Elena." There was a silence so profound on the other end that I thought the line had gone dead. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "Elena." That is impossible. They said you were dead. I am very much alive, I said. But I need you to listen to me carefully. I am in Peru. I was in a coma. Sarah, they are liquidating everything. Sarah did not waste time with weeping or questions about the afterlife. She immediately shifted into defense mode. Elena, if you are alive, you need to stay that way for a little longer. If they know you are coming, they will cover their tracks. We need to catch them in the act. That night, lying in the humid dark of the clinic, I became a detective in my own life. Using the nurse's phone, I accessed the secure back end of my personal finances. Mark knew my bank passwords, but he did not know about the encrypted cloud drive where I backed up every legal document. That was my vantage point. What I found made my blood run cold. The first smoking gun was a power of attorney document uploaded to the county clerk's digital records. It granted Mark full control over my estate. I zoomed in on the signature. It was a passable imitation of my handwriting, but the date next to it read October 15th. On October 15th, I was lying unconscious in this bed, intubated and fighting for my life. It was a clumsy, desperate forgery. I followed the money trail. Mark had not just sold the company. He had butchered it. He had offloaded 40% of Aurospace Solutions to our biggest competitor for pennies on the dollar. He wanted fast cash, likely to pay off the gambling debts he thought I did not know about. Then I checked my parents' accounts, which were linked to a trust I managed. A deposit of $500,000 had hit their joint account just last week. The source code indicated it was an advance on my life insurance policy. They had claimed financial hardship to get the payout early, and what did they do with the blood money? They bought a vacation villa in Florida. They were sunning themselves on a patio paid for with my death. But the final blow, the one that shattered the last remnant of my love for them, was in an email chain between Mark and a headmaster at a boarding school in rural Idaho. "She is a disruption," Mark had written. "We need a facility that handles difficult cases. Somewhere affordable." They were sending Lily to a warehouse for unwanted children. They were discarding my daughter to save money on tuition so they could buy sports cars and beach houses. I put the phone down and stared at my broken leg. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I asked the doctor for my charts. I needed proof of my condition on the dates they forged my signature. Every medical report, every time-stamped vitals check, every note from the nurses became a bullet in my gun. The next morning, I started physical therapy. The pain was excruciating. When the therapist bent my knee, white spots danced in my vision. But instead of crying out, I visualized Mark's face. I visualized my mother signing the deed to that villa. I visualized Lily sitting alone in a dorm room. Again, I told the therapist, sweat dripping down my face. Push it harder. I pushed my body beyond its limits because I needed to get back to Seattle. I was not going back to reclaim my husband or my parents. I was going back to destroy them. I would not just sue them. I would dismantle their reputations, strip them of every cent they stole, and ensure that when I walked into that courtroom, they would wish the mountain had actually killed me. Sarah Jenkins started the war with a single piece of paper. From her office in downtown Seattle, she filed an emergency motion challenging the procedural validity of the expedited probate process. She did not reveal that I was breathing and plotting in a rented apartment just 3 miles away. She simply cited irregularities in the documentation and demanded a pause. The effect was immediate. The judge issued a temporary freeze on all assets pending a review. The silence from the bank accounts must have been deafening. Through the remote access I still had to the smart home security system, I watched the alliance between my husband and my parents crumble in real time. "You and your greed," Mark shouted in the living room, pacing back and forth while my parents sat on the sofa, looking small and frightened. "I told you not to buy that house yet. Now the court is sniffing around because you could not wait a month to spend the insurance money. Do not speak to us like that." My father, Robert, retorted, though his voice lacked its usual pompous authority. "You are the one who rushed the sale of the company. You made it look suspicious." I watched them turn on each other like rats in a sinking ship. feeling a cold, dark satisfaction. They were terrified, not of losing me, but of losing the lifestyle my death had promised them. Getting back to Seattle had been a nightmare of logistics and pain. I had traveled under a false name, enduring a 12-hour flight with a leg that throbbed in time with the engines. I moved through the airport in a wheelchair, buried under an oversized coat, a scarf, and dark sunglasses. I looked like just another injured tourist, invisible to the world. I rented a dingy studio apartment with a view of a brick wall, a stark contrast to the lake house I used to own. But it served its purpose. It was my war room. The hardest part was not the physical pain, it was the torture of the digital window into my old life. I spent hours staring at the tablet screen, watching the live feed from the cameras Mark had forgotten to disconnect. I watched him bring a woman home. She was young, perhaps 25, and she walked through my front door with an air of entitlement that made my stomach turn. I saw them drinking vintage wine from my cellar, spilling red drops on the white rug I had handpicked in Italy. "Do not worry about the judge," Mark told her, laughing as he poured more wine. "It is just a formality. Elena is gone, and the money is mine. Ours." But the rage I felt toward Mark was nothing compared to the agony of seeing Lily. The camera in the backyard showed my daughter sitting on the swing set, pushing herself back and forth with a listless rhythm. She was wearing a dress that looked 2 sizes too small, and her hair, usually neatly braided, was a tangled mess. She looked like a stray animal in her own home. There was no nanny, no grandmother, no father, just a lonely little girl staring at the ground. I stood up, grabbing my crutches, ready to storm out the door and tear that house apart with my bare hands. "No," Sarah said firmly, catching my arm. She had come over to review the final strategy. "If you go there now, you blow the element of surprise. You get Lily back, but they might get away with the fraud. We need a clean sweep. Elena, we need them in handcuffs." "Look at her, Sarah," I choked out, pointing at the screen. "They are neglecting her." "And they will pay for it," Sarah promised. "But we need the kill shot." The kill shot arrived the next morning. Sarah's private investigator had managed to clone Mark's phone data when he carelessly connected to a public Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop. We had an audio file. I pressed play. It was a recording of a phone call between Mark and his mistress. "Are you sure the signature will hold up?" the woman's voice asked. "Babe, relax," Mark's voice replied, arrogant and clear. "I practiced it for weeks. It is flawless. By the time anyone looks closely, the money will be offshore, and the kid will be in Idaho." I stopped the recording. That was it. That was the nail in their coffin. The night before the hearing, I did not sleep. I laid out my clothes for court, a sharp navy suit that fit a little looser now, and the medical boot for my leg. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was thinner, paler, and scarred, but her eyes were burning with a fire that had burned away all the softness. I was no longer the victim. I was the reckoning. Tomorrow, I would walk through those doors and remind them that the dead do not always stay buried. The heavy oak doors swung open with a groan that echoed through the silent chamber. I did not rush. I could not rush. I advanced into the room, the rhythmic thud of my crutches against the hardwood floor acting as a metronome for the impending chaos. I held my head high, channeling every ounce of rage into a posture of regal defiance. The effect was instantaneous. The air in the courtroom seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sheer impossibility of my presence. The murmurs of the clerks, the rustling of papers, the low hum of the ventilation, everything ceased. It was a silence so absolute it felt physical, pressing down on the lungs of everyone present. Mark was mid-sentence, his hand raised in a gesture of practiced grief. "Trying to do what is best for the fam." The word died in his throat, his jaw went slack. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a wax figure melting under heat. The styrofoam cup of water he had been holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the table, splashing water over his expensive Italian suit. But he did not even flinch. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror that looked deliciously like madness. "No!" My mother, Susan, let out a shrill, piercing shriek that bounced off the high ceilings. She clutched her chest, her face contorted in panic, while my father, Robert, slumped back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. He looked as if he were staring at a ghost, which, in a way, he was. Order, order in this court. The judge banged his gavel furiously, his eyebrows knitting together in confusion as the gallery began to buzz with shock. "Who is this woman, bailiff? Secure the entrance." "There is no need for security, Your Honor," I said. My voice was steady, louder and stronger than I felt. I limped past the gallery, past the stunned faces of the family friends who had mourned me at a fake funeral, and stopped directly in front of the bench. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up and removed the dark sunglasses. I tilted my head to let the harsh courtroom lights catch the jagged, pink scar that ran from my hairline down to my left eyebrow, a permanent souvenir from the Andes that my husband had never bothered to ask about. "I am Elena Vance," I declared, my eyes locking onto Mark's trembling form. "And I never signed any papers authorizing these con artists to sell my life." The room erupted in gasps. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward immediately, slamming a thick binder onto the judge's bench with a satisfying thud. "Your Honor," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "we are submitting immediate evidence proving that the power of attorney documents were notarized on October 15th. On that date, my client was in a medically induced coma in a remote clinic in Peru. We have the medical logs, the doctor's affidavit, and a handwriting analysis confirming the signature is a forgery." Mark scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over in the process. He looked around wildly, sweat beading on his forehead. I did not know, Your Honor. We thought she was dead. The authorities said there were no survivors. We were just trying to handle her estate. I thought I was doing what she wanted." "Liar," I said. It was not a scream. It was a statement of fact, cold and hard as the stone that had crushed my leg. "Mr. Vance claims ignorance," Sarah continued, pulling a single sheet of paper from a separate folder and holding it up. "However, we have subpoenaed the server logs from his personal email account. This is a deleted email dated November 2nd, sent from the clinic in Peru, with the subject line, Patient Identification Inquiry. It contained a photo of Elena Vance, unconscious but alive. Mr. Vance received it, opened it, and then deleted it permanently from his trash folder 2 minutes later." The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a predator closing its jaws. Mark looked at the paper in Sarah's hand, and for the first time, I saw the arrogance vanish completely, replaced by the crushing weight of the truth. He knew I was alive. He had left me there to rot, and now every single person in that room knew it too. Judge Harrison stared at the printed email in his hand for a long, heavy silence. When he looked up, his expression was no longer one of judicial impartiality. It was the look of a man barely containing his disgust. He did not just drop the papers. He threw them down onto the bench. "This court has seen enough," the judge boomed, his voice shaking the walls. "I am issuing an immediate and permanent freeze on every single asset associated with the Vance estate, including the personal accounts of all petitioners. Not one dime moves without my direct authorization." The panic in the room was palpable, a physical scent of sweat and fear. Mark, realizing the walls were closing in, did exactly what I expected a coward to do. He turned on his allies. "It was not my idea," Mark shouted, pointing a trembling finger at my father. "Robert set it up. I did not know how to fake a notary seal. Robert said he knew a guy who could backdate the documents. He told me we had to move fast before the news cycle changed. He said Elena would want us to be comfortable." My father, Robert, leaped to his feet, his face turning a shade of purple I had never seen before. The refined, grandfatherly mask he had worn for the press dissolved instantly. "You lying snake!" Robert screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "You told us she was never coming back. You said to Susan and me that you wished the landslide had done a better job so you would not have to deal with a divorce. This was your plan. Mark, you have been complaining about her success for years. You saw a chance to steal her company and you took it." "Order, sit down," the bailiff barked, moving toward the table, but the sharks were already in a feeding frenzy. My mother, Susan, was sobbing, but it was not for me. She was clutching her pearls, wailing about how she could not go to prison at her age. They were tearing each other apart, stripping away the veneer of family to reveal the rotting greed underneath. I stood there, leaning on my crutches, watching them. I waited for a pang of sadness. I waited to feel heartbroken that my parents were monsters and my husband was a sociopath. But I felt nothing. It was like watching a nature documentary where scavengers fight over a scrap of meat. The love I had for them had died in that ravine in Peru. Sarah Jenkins raised her hand. "Your Honor, if I may, we have one final witness regarding the welfare of the minor child, Lily Vance." The side door opened, and Mrs. Gomez walked in. She was our former housekeeper, a woman Mark had fired 2 months ago. She looked terrified, clutching her purse. But when she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Gomez," Sarah asked gently, "why were you terminated from your employment at the Vance residence?" "Mr. Mark fired me," Mrs. Gomez said, her voice trembling but clear. "He caught me letting Lily use my phone to call her aunt. He told me. He said that Lily did not need to talk to anyone who would ask questions. He said the girl was baggage and he was going to ship her off to Idaho so he could have his life back." A gasp rippled through the gallery. That was the final blow. The judge's face hardened into stone. "The petitioners have not only committed fraud upon this court, but have demonstrated a gross negligence toward the welfare of a child," Judge Harrison declared. "I am hereby voiding all power of attorney documents ab initio. I am declaring the will null and void. Furthermore, based on the sworn testimony and evidence presented here regarding forgery and fraud, I am holding Mark Vance, Robert Miller, and Susan Miller in contempt." He turned to the bailiffs, his finger pointing accusation like a weapon. "Take them into custody. I am referring this entire transcript to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for immediate charges of grand larceny, fraud, and child endangerment." The click of handcuffs was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. "Elena!" Mark screamed as the officer yanked his arms behind his back. "Elena! Please! I was scared. I did not mean it. I love you. Do not let them take me." He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, begging for the mercy he had denied me when I was bleeding in the jungle. I looked him dead in the eye. "You should have checked for a pulse." "Mark," I said softly. I turned my back on him. I turned my back on my parents, who were being led away, weeping and cursing. I hobbled toward Sarah, who was gathering our files with a grim satisfaction. We had won the war in this room. The assets were safe. The villains were in chains. But as I walked out of the courtroom, leaving their screams behind me, I knew the victory was hollow. The money did not matter. The house did not matter. The only thing that mattered was a confused 7-year-old girl waiting for me, and the long, hard road we had to walk to heal the damage they had done. The sound of the gavel striking the woodblock was the most satisfying music I had ever heard. 12 years. That was the price the state of Washington determined Mark should pay for trading my life for a wire transfer. He stood there in a jumpsuit that washed out his complexion, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He did not look at me as the bailiffs led him away. He looked at the floor, finally understanding that his charm had expired. My parents, Robert and Susan, were spared the indignity of a prison cell only because of their advanced age. But their sentence was perhaps more cruel for people of their vanity. The judge gave them 5 years of strict probation and ordered full restitution. They would have to sell everything the condo I had bought them, the jewelry, the cars to pay back the money they had frantically spent. But the true punishment was the social exile. Seattle is a small town for the wealthy. They were pariahs now. Their friends had already stopped returning their calls. The country club had revoked their memberships. They were left with nothing but their shame and each other. With the criminal conviction secured, the family court proceedings were a formality. I was granted an immediate divorce and 100% legal and physical custody of Lily. The judge stripped Mark of all parental rights, citing his willingness to abandon his child to a boarding school for financial gain. I also secured a permanent restraining order against my parents. They would never whisper poison into my daughter's ear again. My next battle was corporate. The competitor Mark had sold 40% of my company to was in a panic. They were facing a public relations nightmare for capitalizing on a fraud. When I walked into their boardroom, not as a ghost, but as the rightful owner, the CEO could barely meet my eyes. I bought back my shares at cost. They were so desperate to distance themselves from the scandal that they signed the papers without a single negotiation. Aurospace was dead, tainted by the months Mark had spent dismantling it. I rebranded the very next day. I called an all-hands meeting and stood on a stage before my confused, terrified employees. If you helped Mark Vance hide the truth, if you signed papers you knew were false, or if you helped him purge my loyalists, I said, my voice echoing in the silent hall, you have 1 hour to clear your desks. I fired 12 senior executives that afternoon. I watched security escort them out, clutching their cardboard boxes. And then I promoted the assistants and junior managers who had tried to blow the whistle. I could not go back to the house on Lake Washington. It was a beautiful shell filled with rot. I sold it to a developer within a week and moved Lily into a penthouse in the city center. It was a fortress of glass and steel with 24-hour security and private elevator access. There were no dark corners here, only light. On the day I moved in, the concierge called up to say my parents were in the lobby. I told him to let them up, but only as far as the elevator vestibule. I met them there. They looked frail, stripping away the arrogance that had defined them my whole life. Elena, my mother wept, reaching out a trembling hand. Please, we are family. We made a mistake. We just wanted security. I looked at them and felt a vast, arctic emptiness. You did not want security, I said, my voice steady. You wanted money. You had a daughter who loved you, and you traded her for a villa in Florida. The Elena who forgave you died in that ravine. We are your parents, my father pleaded, his voice cracking. No, I replied, pressing the button to close the elevator doors. You are just two people who owe me a lot of money. As the doors slid shut, cutting off their sobbing, I felt lighter than I had in years. I went back upstairs and sat at my desk. I wrote a check for a significant sum, addressed to the clinic in the Andes that had stitched me back together. I included a note asking them to use it for search and rescue equipment for the locals. It was a debt of honor. I had reclaimed my life, my child, and my company. The parasites were gone. All that was left was to live. The late afternoon sun filtered through the turning leaves of Cary Park, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. It was a crisp October day, the kind that smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I sat on a wooden bench, wrapped in a cashmere coat that I had bought with my own money, earned from my new company. My cane rested against the bench, no longer a necessity for walking, but a companion I was not quite ready to leave behind. I watched Lily near the slide. She was laughing, a bright, uninhibited sound that I had not heard in months. She was chasing a stray dog that had wandered off its leash, her hair bouncing in the wind. For a long time, I thought I would never see that joy again. I thought her spirit had been crushed under the weight of abandonment, just as my body had been crushed under the Andean mud. I reached up and traced the faint line of the scar on my forehead. The plastic surgeons had offered to remove it completely, to sand it down until my skin was as flawless as it had been before the accident. I refused. That scar was a map of my survival. It was a reminder that the people who were supposed to love me, the parents who raised me and the husband who vowed to cherish me, had looked at my life and seen only a dollar sign. They had taught me a lesson about the cruelty of the human heart that no business school could ever teach. But they also taught me the invincible value of standing on my own 2 feet. "Mommy, look." Lily came running toward me, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. She held out a piece of paper, crinkled from being clutched in her small hand. "I drew this for you," she said, out of breath. I took the drawing. It was done in bright, aggressive crayons. In the center, there were 2 figures standing under a massive, radiant yellow sun. One was tall with long hair, and the other was small with a pink bow. We were holding hands. There was no third figure. There were no grandparents in the background. The empty space where Mark used to be was filled with flowers and birds. "It is beautiful, baby," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It is just us now," Lily said matter-of-factly, climbing onto the bench to sit beside me. "And that is better, right?" "Yes," I whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It is much better." I pressed my face into her hair, inhaling the scent of the autumn air clinging to her coat. I could feel her small heart beating against my chest. This rhythm was the only thing that mattered. Mark could rot in his cell for 12 years. My parents could scream at each other in their empty, rented apartment until they turned to dust. They could not touch this. For months. I thought my victory would be the moment the judge banged his gavel. I thought satisfaction would come from seeing the fear in their eyes. But as I held my daughter, I realized the true revenge was not their punishment. It was my happiness. The greatest retaliation against those who wanted me dead was to live a life more vibrant, more successful, and more full of love than they could ever comprehend. I did not need them. I never did. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a country code for Switzerland. It was the call I had been expecting from a luxury hotel group in Zurich. They had seen the portfolio for my new design firm and wanted to fly me out to discuss a multi-million-dollar contract for their new alpine resort. I looked at the phone, then at Lily. She nodded, as if she knew exactly what the call meant. "Hello," I answered, my voice steady and commanding. "This is Elena?" "Yes. I would be delighted to discuss the project. My team and I are ready." I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at the Seattle skyline, the city where I had almost lost everything, and felt a surge of power. "We are going to be busy, Lily," I told her. "I know," she smiled. "We are going to be great." I made a silent vow then, to myself and to the little girl holding my hand. Never again would I let anyone else hold the pen that wrote our story. We were the architects of our own fate now. "Come on," I said, standing up and offering her my hand. "Let's go get some hot chocolate." Lily grabbed my hand, her grip strong and warm. We walked away from the bench, stepping onto the path covered in a carpet of gold and crimson leaves. The wind picked up, swirling around us, but we did not shiver. We walked forward, our footsteps crunching rhythmically on the fallen leaves, leaving the long, dark shadow of the past behind us, fading into the twilight. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you're tuning in from. So please leave a comment below, sharing your location and your thoughts on Elena's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel Mira Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help the story reach even more listeners.